It's a privilege today for me to introduce Associate Professor Bruce Buchan from Griffith University. We're very pleased that Bruce has come out to us and is presenting his research. He was a future fellow, ESC future fellow, and works on a range of themes related to modernity, history of modernity, from corruption to violence to security, and also has a particular interest in the visual, which links up to what we do here, and we very much look forward to hearing from Bruce. And as always, we do presentations maximum of 30 minutes, so that we have plenty of time for feedback and discussion, and all in the spirit basically of providing you feedback on your project and input, and that's sort of the idea that we help each other out and try to get each other's work improved. So thanks in advance, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Roland. It might be 31 minutes. I hope I won't be penalised for the extra. I'd like to begin with a question. How do we see security? Is it seen in images of peace and safety, or is it perceived in the depiction of the horrors of violence and suffering? The question isn't really an obvious one, because security is not typically thought to be a quality of vision or indeed of the other senses. Rather, security is typically thought to pertain to the question of bodily integrity. Yet security, I argue, is an uncanny concept in contemporary neoliberalism, a ghostly presence measured by its present absence. I've named this spectral quality of neoliberal security Antigonish, in echo of the rhyme penned in 1899 by William Hughes Mearns, after hearing tales of a haunted house in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Most of us know the first verse in one of its many variations. As I was coming down the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. Neoliberal security is uncanny in precisely the same way as that man encountered on the staircase in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Like him, neoliberal security is there by being absent. Security is mobilised in neoliberal polities in a preemptive mode to contain potential threats or to manage anticipated risks in the name of liberty or efficiency. By these means, the reach of neoliberal government is telescoped in both spatial and temporal dimensions, seeming at once to compress space by prioritising the global circulation of goods, money and things, while accelerating time to accommodate the algorithmic speed of financial transactions. In the neoliberal democracies of the Anglosphere, these techniques have imbibed a pervasive militarisation in which the mobilisation of perpetual war, whether it be on drugs or on crime, or perhaps most tellingly now on terror, provides new opportunities for the expansion of market imperatives by both force and fraud. Neoliberal security owes much to Thomas Hobbes, for whom security was construed as a state of perpetual anticipation. Hobbesian security has proved an enormously powerful asset to the tradition of Western liberalism, and it continues to provide fertile service in contemporary neoliberal discourse. Framing security in Hobbes's way perpetuates the neat assumption that security should be understood as an effect of contractual arrangements between subjects to establish sovereignty. Sorry, I lost my place. While mobilising discursive strategies under the radar that enable the security of some to be paired with and sustained by the perpetual insecurity of others. So in this paper, I want to consider the history of the visual framing of security in order to reflect on how the desire for security is activated in the depiction of its absence. The image of security has long been paired with insecurity in the history of Western thought and culture, but where neoliberalism innovates is in making the perception of insecurity omnipresent, feeding a perpetually renewed wellspring of terror. I want to begin by exploring the visualisation of neoliberal security in two images of death. And here is an advance warning to anyone who might be upset by the vision of an actual dead body. I'm about to show a confronting photograph of a human corpse. The two images I've chosen to juxtapose our moment of frightful terror in a world whose supposed order is unravelling in unquenchable streams of blood, with a time 500 years ago when many also perceived a great unwinding of the order of the world. and indeed the cosmos in an unleashed fury of bloodletting and cruelty. So here is the first image. It is a photograph of a dead man on an operating table in a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz in Afghanistan that was attacked apparently by mistake in late 2015 by an American gunship as part of the continuing, now 16-year-long war on terror. The photograph was taken a week after the attack by photojournalist Andrew Quilty, and it later won a Walkley Photo of the Year award. The body in the photo is Mr. Benazar Mohammed Nazar, 43, a husband and father of 4. The photo was published with the consent of Mr. Nazar's wife and son, who believed that the image needed to be seen. Once seen, it can never be forgotten. The image encapsulates human frailty, the transience of life cruelly taken, precisely at the moment when Mr. Nazar had hope of medical treatment, and there is a double cruelty in that also. The image also captures the death of a hospital, a place we associate with the restoration of health, and a site supposed to be privileged from the violence of war. The hospital itself has become a slaughterhouse. War and violence have turned the world upside down. My second image dates from the tumultuous early years of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, 1521 to 22 to be precise. It is The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb by Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein's is a calculatedly confronting image of the deathly rigour and putrefaction of the human Jesus. Holbein's is a late product of a long tradition stretching back to Byzantine iconographic tropes, depicting Christ either dead upon the cross or enthroned after resurrection. The point of these icons was precisely to underscore the divinity of Christ at the moment that his most vulnerable and frail humanity terminates. Western European artists adopted and adapted this tradition from about the middle of the 13th century, where it developed its own stylistic tropes, especially in images of Christ as the Man of Sorrows. Holbein here gives us the frail humanity of the dead Jesus, the agonised face, the rictus of his bony fingers, and his bruised wounds. His image confronts us in presenting death, and that an anguished and agonising death, as the avenue for contemplation of and access to the divine. There is no mediation of the agony by scenes of lamentation or by perspectival tricks distancing us from the corpse itself. Holbein instead has us literally in the tomb with Christ, in frightful intimacy with his corpse. Now, I've used this quote by Julia Kristeva to highlight a point of difference between the images of Mr. Nazar and Holbein's Dead Christ. For her, the corpse or cadaver signifies a falling away from being. The corpse, she wrote, shows me what I permanently thrust aside in order to live. There I am at the border of my condition as a living being. My body extricates itself as being alive from that border. The corpse, the most sickening of wastes, is a border that has encroached upon everything. Kristeva's quote neatly encapsulates a distinctly modern sensibility, wherein the boundary represented by the corpse has become perpetual, drawing everything within the territory of mortality. But the existential opposition Kristeva identifies between the abject corpse and the living subject was not so firmly drawn in medieval European culture. Holbein's image of the dead Christ is a deliberate encroachment, in Kristeva's terms, that is meant to take us beyond the limit of our physical existence. But it was to do so in a kind of rhapsody of death that was once a guarantee, not a denial of personal security. Holbein's image is thus an enlivening of the dead in intimate companionship with the living. Holbein presents Christ's rotting mortality as a smorgasbord of putrefaction to overwhelm and enrapture us, synesthetically bearing us toward the divine. In doing so, however, Holbein was not innovating, but moulding an established tradition of depicting the suffering Christ as the Man of Sorrows. In early depictions of the Man of Sorrows, he was often shown dead or dying upon the cross, but always copiously bleeding from his 5 wounds. In later images, Christ was typically shown in deathly contemplation of his wounds, often carrying the armour Christi, the instruments of his final humiliation, such as the scourge and the whip that you can see pictured in the later image at the bottom here. In some devotional images of the Man of Sorrows, his body was kaleidoscopically rendered in a myriad depiction merely of the Arma Christi themselves, or his body fragmented and reduced to the lurid depictions of miraculously bleeding wounds. The 5 wounds of Christ that Christ was said to suffer at the crucifixion were thought by the devout to represent the possibility of salvation. The wounds became privileged objects of devotion, revered as thresholds of the divine, or as portals through which salvation may be achieved by opening a way to Christ's sacred heart. The wounds on Christ's body were to be read not simply as abstract metaphors or empty symbols, but as real physical spaces in which the divine was made present, tactile, and could even be tasted, revealed especially in the Ostentatio Vulnerum. You can see in the photograph of the statue, Christ showing his side wound. Indeed, the security afforded by devotion to the wounds and blood of Christ's own physical insecurity was thought of as a kind of medicine for the soul. For this reason, greater significance was attributed to Christ's copiously flowing blood. In the late Middle Ages, often depicted gushing out of gaping wounds in ever greater quantities, trickling down his tortured limbs, sometimes caught in a golden chalice. Here, the duality of Christ as mortal man and as God mirrored the duality of blood as both life force and sign of death. Christ's blood shed was a message for the devout. His blood was the substance of his human sacrifice and a medium for our salvation, and hence of our ultimate security. It was this spiritual affirmation that enabled the ever more graphic visualization of vulnerable and traumatized Christly suffering to be understood as images of simultaneous but coterminous security and insecurity. In other words, these images operated as a bridge between the insecurity of our profane life and the infinite security of salvation. In that sense, the condition of simultaneous security and insecurity was coterminous, insofar as the evident physical insecurity depicted in the Man of Sorrows or in Holbein's Dead Christ was merely an interlude or a pause along the way toward ultimate and eternal security through salvation. Insecurity and security were linked at a single moment where one condition gave way to another, where insecurity gave way to security, where life was sundered by death and death conquered by eternal life. The coterminous boundary was not a physical demarcation, but a moment in time, or to be more precise, it was the moment at which time gave way to eternity. So let me return here to the Quilty photograph of Mr. Nazar on the operating table. Superficially, the image invites a comparison with Holbein's painting of the Dead Christ, but whereas Holbein's artwork can be understood as an image of simultaneous and coterminous security and insecurity, symbolised by the frame of Christ's grave open before us, Quilty's photograph of Mr. Nazar offers no such hope. In Holbein, the sarcophagus itself is a portal, a scoped projection from the most sacred of portals, Christ's side wound. Through the borders of the sepulchral entrance, the pious viewer attains hope of sacred deliverance from trial and from terror. In Quilty's photograph, simultaneous security and insecurity has been distilled into an image of perpetual insecurity, typified by the placement of the corpse on the operating table, a site of remediation permanently ruptured. Here there is no way through, but a perpetual withholding. Quilty's is a perfect depiction of the unmediated and irredeemably abject insecurity generated by the neoliberal war on terror. Unlike Holbein's image of Christ, who is known by and revered in his death, Mr. Nazar's body has been stripped of identity and dignity. Defiled by the indifferent fall of rubble and begrimed by a carpet of dust from exploded masonry, Quilty's image encapsulates the random and unexpected slaughter to be expected from both terrorism and war. And the banality of dust belies a key distinction between these two images of death. Dust is the patiner of the mundane. Dust coats the surface of things. It is a layer of ubiquitous grime laid down in time. Its presence is a visible reminder of the passage of time measured by inexorable decay. Holbein's dead Christ is transcendent in death. His is the pallor of timelessness. Undefiled by mere dust, Christ embodies the sacredness of the deathly undead. He is literally out of time. The body of Mr. Nazar, by contrast, has been left exposed to the continual fall of dust. His body has become a surface begrimed by the passage of time. Mr. Nazar's abjection is a symbol of the Antigonish security of neoliberalism. As an image, it distills the horror that comes from the exposure of frailty and vulnerability to inexorable forces of destruction, cruelty, and suffering. The image invokes the terror awakened by our mutual exposure to perpetual insecurity. The avid consumption of such images, instantaneously reflected and refracted through numberless screens, frames security in present horror and future terror. It is the awareness that security itself is always presently absent, unattainably impending in the passage of time, that begrimes everything in dust. At this point, let me turn back briefly to the history of images of security in order to underscore the visual fiat of neoliberalism. Images of security have a long history, but depictions of the concept itself are rare. And one of these few is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's fresco of 1338-39 in the Sala di Nove of the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. In Lorenzetti's vision, the barely clad and beautiful form of a young, female, angelic Securitas flies out over a peaceful, orderly, and productive contado of tilled fields, sturdy homesteads, and safe highways conveying prosperous merchants, demonstrating the salutary effects of a well-governed city. This image has recently been read as typical of a pervasive medieval concept of security, understood simply as the removal of threats. This negative quality of security, however, pays little regard to the dependence of this image on the simultaneous visualization of insecurity. The force of Lorenzetti's fresco derived from its presentation of good government and its effects, painted on one wall of the Sala di Nove, and bad government and its effects on the opposite wall. Hence, Siena's governing council, the Nine, processed to judgment beneath Lorenzetti's frescoed alternatives, towering over them on the right, the auspicious side, and their left, the sinister side. The frescoes and their deliberate placement were a vivid presentation of viable alternatives governors and subjects confronted each and every time they cast political judgment. Hence, Lorenzetti's images of the virtues of good government corresponded graphically, morally, and politically to his images of the vices of bad government. Securitas was paired with the corresponding image of Timur, fear, flying out over the walls of the city, foundering under bad government, to reign over a blasted landscape of burned farmhouses, tumbled bridges, ruined crops, and highways haunted by gangs of armed thugs. Timur herself is pictured as a witch-like crone clad in rags with dishevelled hair and a cadaverous look, clutching in her emaciated hand a sword symbolising arbitrary violence and terror. In contrast, the controlled legal violence of Securitas is symboled by the abject figure hanging from a gallows that she holds in her outstretched hand, in affirmation of the proposition familiar in late medieval humanist scholarship that by the terror of punishment and the certainty of law, the well-governed city provides ample security to its subjects. So Timur and Securitas operated together in this cycle of frescoes, representing, for those in whose hands the fate of the city rested, two divergent but viable forks in the road. Timur and Securitas operated as simultaneous and coterminous security and insecurity. Each was a viable, potent option, but bound to finite moments in time, the one ending as the other began. This visualisation of simultaneous and coterminous security and insecurity ends with Thomas Hobbes. To see why, we need only look at the frontispiece to his 1651 masterwork Leviathan. Hobbes's sovereign was named Leviathan in echo of the biblical sea beast in the book of Job, whose terrifyingly scaly form could be mastered only by God. Hobbes's sovereign Leviathan was a literally terrifying creature, a beast of security, that Hobbes famously described as that mortal God to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defence. The sovereign, Hobbes wrote, hath the use of so much power and strength that by the terror thereof this beastly monster is able to override our own violent and competitive nature to ensure peace at home and defence against enemies abroad. The function of the sovereign Leviathan was to terrify us into security. The conceit of the 1651 frontispiece image is that the body of the Hobbesian sovereign is made up from the bodies of those who've contracted to form it. The Leviathan thus appears in this image as a composite body, the individual subjects making up its form resembling the scales of the biblical beast. Significantly, the sovereign Leviathan is framed in panoramic vision, in spectacular demonstration of its awesome status. Hobbes's sovereign's eye sees all. His mighty arms overreach the puny works of his tiny subjects. The subjects themselves are shown with their backs turned to the viewer, as if they are all in pilgrimage or homage to the sovereign, looking up and inward into the body of the beast. The sovereign's gaze alone is directed outward over a panoramically rendered landscape and cityscape, a terrain of security, surveyed, known, controlled. The sovereign towers mountainously over denuded fields and streets, dominating the scale of both nature and civil society. Hence, here, security is panoramic in its ambition and its sweep. The Leviathan of Hobbes's frontispiece stands over and dominates territory. The security offered by Leviathan is not agoraphobic, like that offered by the frightful intimacy of Holbein's Dead Christ. Rather, the security offered by Hobbes's Leviathan is claustrophobic. Leviathan surveys an entire landscape and cityscape of security. Leviathan does not merely shelter bodies, but is made from them. It is here that the scopic conceit of the frontispiece image reveals itself in our, the viewer's, exclusion from the interior lines of sight within the body of the sovereign. The tiny subjects who make up the sovereign's body look inwardly. On looking at the frontispiece, we see only their backs, but we are held in sight by the sovereign alone. The effect is deliberate. We have not joined the contract for security, and we are thus invited to imagine ourselves remaining in the insecure state of nature. As such, we must imagine ourselves to be outside the social compact for security, and thus apprehended by the securitizing sovereign gaze as a potential threat. The sightlines built into the frontispiece are thus an affirmation of the disruptive nature of Hobbesian security. It is a condition guaranteed only by the creation of a literally awesome, godlike sovereignty. In its absence, we can only comprehend security by its present absence. It impends on us through anticipation, but it remains essentially elusive. Now, Carl Schmitt famously interpreted Hobbes's sovereign divinity as an admission of the theological basis of modern sovereignty, and thus symbolic of the mythic structure of modern political thought. More importantly, by speaking of the attributes of sovereignty as godlike, Hobbes effectively liberated the sovereign from the contingency of the present, enabling the resolution of our perennial anticipation of insecurity. Hobbes's now classic description of the catastrophic condition of insecurity was framed temporally in terms of the individual's perpetual vulnerability to potential threat. What enabled Hobbes to construe security in temporal terms was a shift in the understanding of time itself in Europe's early modern period, whereby the measurement of time was transformed from a reckoning toward a finite and certain end to the measurement of the rapidity of time's unfolding toward an open future, demanding an orientation toward change as constant and unbound. The effect of this intellectual development was to open the future as a field of indeterminate expectation. In response, the field of government expanded, not only under the imperative of necessity, but of preemption, securing society and state on the basis of knowledge about the spaces and bodies within it, and the strengths and vulnerabilities they represented. This change enabled the conceptual step Hobbes undertook to endow security with a temporal dimension, to cast it forward into an indeterminate future, or as Hobbes himself put it, there is no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable as anticipation, that is, by force or wiles to master the persons of all men he can, so long till he see no other power great enough to endanger him. Security thereby came to refer, as Foucault memorably described it, to a series of possible events. It refers to the temporal and the uncertain. In this sense, the vision of security and insecurity could continue to be simultaneous, but were no longer coterminous. Security and insecurity no longer shared a border, but became domains of perpetual suspension in the mutable flux of time. Envisioning security highlights this temporal dimension. Security exists not just in space and place, but in time. Security is forever forestalled by infinitude. Security of person, property, or polity is a dynamic relation of present means to future uncertainty. Security is thus clouded by obscurity, forever cast forward into an apprehended future that recedes beyond our comprehension. It is this feature of security, its obscurity, that seems highlighted by the surging tide of digital images of profound cruelty, shot, shocked and shared on social media, momentarily renewed and replaced at dizzying speed. As long ago as 1826, the now little-known pioneer of Gothic fiction, Anne Radcliffe, suggested that obscurity was the essence of terror. The obscurity or indistinctness of terror, she wrote, leaves the imagination to act upon the few hints that truth reveals to it. And thus, she went on, it may, by mingling and confounding one image with another, absolutely counteract the imagination instead of exciting it. Obscurity leaves something for the imagination to exaggerate. Confusion, by blurring one image into another, leaves only a chaos in which the mind can find nothing to be magnificent, nothing to nourish its fears or doubts, or to act upon in any way. Here, Radcliffe hints at something distinctly of our neoliberal moment. The succession of images, the chaos that comes from a blurring between images, creates an obscurity that is itself terrifying. Terror is a disabling, disorienting fear. Now, she asked in 1826, if obscurity has so much effect on fiction, what must it have in real life? Indeed, what effect must it have when we contemplate the fountainhead of visualised horror tapped by the neoliberal war on terror? In concluding, let me merely gesture to one example, the images so carefully framed by Islamic State executioners of terrifying televised and tweeted beheadings. At one level, the all too fragile, precarious humanity of the victims is heightened by the explicit horror of these images. There is nothing obscure about them at all. Horror is a revulsion that grips the self, binding it by the ocular nerve to proximate scenes of cruelty, suffering and violence. Terror is the effect of immersion in a surging tide of such images, an effect that becomes the object of campaigns of terrorism. Terrorism aims to mobilise a generalisable condition of disorienting fear, a fear so profound it disrupts the framework of norms and expectations among the target population. Although the particular victims of these acts of terror are meant to be clearly, horrifyingly identifiable, it is their and our vulnerability to attack, their and our random replaceability by any other individual that elicits our terror. So let me merely refer to one example. that of the image taken before the video beheading of US journalist James Foley in 2014. I've chosen this one example to stand for a particular genre of images deliberately staged and framed for American and Western consumption. These are images of pure, unmediated, unmitigated horror. The essence of the cruelty lies in its pitilessness. The brutality is remorseless. These are images made also for mass consumption and for social media sharing and liking, and there is a cruelty in that also. That cruelty here has been commodified. In the globally integrated social media economy of cruelty, these images are the jackpot. All this suits our offended and horrified consciences, of course, but in a sense this perspective misses an essential connection between the Islamic State beheading images and the Hobbesian frontispiece image of Leviathan. The connection I speak of is that each, in rather different though mutually reinforcing ways, are images of security. Our modern obsession with security derives in part from the ultimate valuation of the term by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan. Hobbesian security is a disruptive concept that is reliant on a visual field that commands both delimited and intimate surveillance and expansive, even panoramic spectacle. Consider the setting of the Islamic State beheading images. Typically, though not exclusively, the Islamic State beheadings take place in open, empty landscapes. Sometimes they take place on beaches. They are brazen crimes, but also the blood shed on those empty fields of vision, that empty terrain, is a consecration of claimed sovereignty. In that sense, Islamic State are viciously aping the bloody tropes of Western imperialism. Each execution is a ceremony of possession, a reanimation of colonial presumption. The Islamic State images are framed, produced from, and indeed made possible by a wider spectacle of warfare beyond the frames. It is war that activates the torture, and it is war that summons the executions. Our gaze beyond the frame reveals a field of vision in which war is revealed in scenes at once sequestered and panoramic, where war registers in the intimate fragility of bodies and in the brutal transformation of entire cities and towns into fields of rubble. Herein lies the effect of the Islamic State images. These are not images of simultaneous security and insecurity, like Lorenzetti's Timur and Securitas or Holbein's Dead Christ, mediated as they were by the accessibility of salvation in and through the image. They are rather images of neoliberal Antagonish security. In the reiterated images of horrific fragmentation amplified by the seemingly endless war on terror, security is the presently absent presence in neoliberal discourse. Neoliberal security is activated by omnipresent horror, relayed, consumed, liked and shared in momentary confirmation that new horrors are ready to erupt at any moment, at any place, an anticipated obscurity constituting our terror, a reflex of perpetual fear ruthlessly played by both terrorists and by governments. The security of visualised insecurity is a neoliberal article of faith, a divine mystery made present in torn flesh. The problem of security at the heart of the neoliberal project is that we cannot see it, but in new horrors. Like that spectral man on the stair in Antagonish, Nova Scotia, we cannot escape the horrible encounter with neoliberal security, nor can we wish it away. Thank you.